Alive. Book 1, Chapter 8. The sun rose behind a low-hanging bank of gray clouds, through which only intermittent beams of light could pass. David lay in the gloom, rolling fitfully on a makeshift bed of damp leaves. The snake wasn't sitting too well, and therefore neither was he. After a time he jumped up and strode quickly to the bushes. He pressed his hands against a tree for balance and bent over until his spasms subsided. This had been going on all night, and David had a vague sense that it was due to the events in the forest with the madman Johnson. But when his stomach had finally cleansed itself of the foul meal he'd ingested, he realized that the snake was the culprit. Regurgitation was one of the uglier bodily functions, and even in the midst of it, David found himself again wondering how Olga carried on with all this pain. But when he was through, and the snake finally gone, his head started to clear. His dark sense of pending doom was lifting as the sun warmed the land. He was feeling better. But then he took note of his condition, and his mood sank again. His shoes and pants were covered in mud and dirt, his shirt stained and torn. He lifted his arm and took a tentative sniff. He moaned. He wasn't going to make much of an impression on anyone in this condition. He certainly did not want Mommy to see him like this. And to top it off, after he had gone through such pains to purge the foul meat, he was hungry again. During his time in the hospital, David had come to take meals for granted, never thinking about how much effort went into obtaining the food necessary to sustain his body. "How many times do I have to do this?" he said. Teddy had been sitting against a tree with its motivators set to standby. The toy was alerted by the sound of David's voice. "Do what, David?" it inquired. David shot a perturbed glance at the mecha, wishing for a moment that he too had no need for food. But after a short bout with envy, he remembered why he had sought out the blue fairy, and his determination came back. "Nothing, Teddy," he said, as he rose and did his best to brush the dirt off his clothes. "I have to find some food," he said. Civilization turned out to be not so far away. It was only 20 minutes later, 9:23 a.m. by Teddy's clock, that they came to a mesh fence which separated the forest from a small asphalt lot. Beyond the lot lay a gathering of shiny gray buildings, and beyond that, a cluster of houses huddled in a quiet cul-de-sac. "Olga," David whispered. He didn't know why he wanted to keep his voice low. He was excited and scared at once. Excited because he was now one of them. He wanted to walk among them, to be accepted and make friends. He was scared because he still had something to hide. He was wanted by a strange man named Grieg or Frank or Jeff. Even if he found Mommy today, he'd have to figure out a way around that obstacle. Teddy called out to him. "Here, David," the toy said. David looked to see a slice in the fence, as if someone had shorn it with scissors. There was a depression of cleared earth that led through the tear. David realized that this hole must be used regularly. He followed Teddy through the fence, working his way carefully past the sharp ends of the metal. He knew that his new body was vulnerable to cuts, and cuts could lead to infection. When he was through the fence, he stopped and stood there for a time, wringing his hands, feeling his nerves strung tight. "Let's go now," Teddy suggested, the black beads of its eyes fixed curiously on David's hesitant stance. David knew that he really had no choice, but he'd never had this kind of fear before. Not when he was He let that thought fall away. He couldn't keep thinking about his other life. It was over now. He stepped cautiously away from the fence out from the cover of trees and onto the asphalt. Large poles shot up from the surface of the lot. Flat glass plates were attached to these poles, with nets hanging from circular rings of metal. David knew this shape, but could not recall it from his databanks. He had no more databanks. But as best he could remember, they were harmless. He continued. Mud that had dried on the bottom of his shoes crumbled loudly as he walked. Even though it was daylight and anyone could see him, David had a desire for stealth. He scraped his feet against the ground until the dirt fell off and he could walk in silence. The buildings were angular, with walls of reflective glass, and arranged in a complex crisscrossing pattern with slate-gray walkways between them. As they grew closer, David could see letters embossed on the biggest of the structures. He struggled with the words, remembering a time when he would have instantly known what was written there. Now he sounded the words out slowly. New Shores High, he said. He was pleased that he'd been able to figure it out, but still the words made no sense. Teddy was already walking ahead, so David forgot about the words and caught up. The asphalt ended at the barrier of another fence, and a walkway proceeded from there, leading to a large passageway. David passed through slowly, unnerved by the sound of his footfalls resonating against the walls. Ahead of them lay another opening, and in the center of the walkway stood a strange object. David crept towards it slowly, expecting at any moment some alarm would go off, alerting invisible sentries to his presence. But it turned out only to be a metal tube that stood about eye level with him. David worked out the words written at the head of the thing. Data kiosk, he realized. His excitement renewed, David slipped the wristband from his arm and sought for instructions on how to use the machine. He noticed the flashing pad next to a series of buttons with numbers on their faces, and he was about to place the bracelet over the pad when he remembered Angelo's warning. "Teddy!" he called. David held Teddy up, and the super toy placed its palm against the pad. It took only a moment for it to find a path past the local area network and open a line to the web. When Teddy was online, an illegal snooper opened in its head, and it quickly found what David was looking for: the State Police All Points Bulletin data feed. "There is an APB, David," Teddy said. "All jurisdictions are cautioned to be on the lookout for an abandoned boy known only as David. Blonde hair, blue eyes, approximately 11 years of age, 60 pounds and 4 feet 6 inches in height. Parents unknown, date of birth unknown, child licensing authority status unverified. Last seen in vicinity of Trenton General Hospital." Teddy fell silent for a moment. "I cannot access any further details. They are restricted." "Are there any—" David paused, trying to remember the words. "Amber alerts?" he said. Teddy didn't respond at first. "Yes, David," it said after a moment. 3 children are reported missing, a boy named Philip and 2 girls. "I don't need to worry about the girls' names, do I?" David said. "I don't know, David," Teddy replied, apologetically. David set Teddy on the ground and stood at the kiosk. He dangled the bracelet above the pad, but didn't set it down. Not yet. The bracelet contained the identity he'd need to use to get around the police and find Mommy. But Angelo had explained that if the identity triggered an Amber Alert, there would be a police response, and he'd have to leave quickly. He couldn't afford to go back into the forest without food, but neither could he continue without an identity. He mulled this problem over for a time, and then slowly set the bracelet on the pad. He was expecting alarms to erupt all around him. Instead, he was greeted by a cheerful voice. "Hello, Susan," the kiosk said. "Susan," David blurted. And welcome to New Shores High, the kiosk continued, home of the Fighting Land Sharks. I'm sorry, but we're not in session at this time. If you have questions about enrollment, please leave your net address. Or you can contact us via the web at newshoreshigh.gov. The kiosk continued, telling Susan about tuitions and the extracurricular activities that were offered to gifted students. But David didn't hear the rest. His attention had been caught by 3 figures moving across the mouth of the hallway. They were dressed in tight, dark clothing and moving quickly over the ground. But they were moving faster than ordinary Orga feet could carry them. Could these be police? So quickly? David slipped the bracelet back onto his wrist and stepped away from the kiosk, hoping that the strangers wouldn't see him. But he was too late. The first of the 3 turned his head in David's direction and slowed. The other 2 followed the gaze of the first, and then they all stopped. With a shock, David now noticed that the strangers did not touch the ground, but their feet were somehow floating a few inches above it. Were they mecha? He smiled and waved a tentative greeting. The 3 did not return his wave. They stood, motionless, staring. Even in the distance, David could see the suspicion in their eyes. He sighed when the strangers started floating slowly in his direction. As the 3 moved closer, David could see that they were boys, about his age, or the age he was supposed to be. The first one was fair, with wavy blonde hair and a snide smirk on his otherwise cherubic face. The second was dark-skinned, and his hair clung to his scalp in tight curls. He looked at David with a skeptically raised eyebrow. The last, the smallest of the 3, was a pale-looking boy with fiery red curls atop his head and freckles along the ridge of his nose. This one looked as if he had something to prove. All 3 were clad in black, skin-tight suits with a single red stripe down the side and hovering over the ground on thin black boards. David became fascinated by the boards as the boys glided in slow circles around him. "What's that, kid?" the blonde boy said, a challenge in his voice. What?" David replied. "What's that? Don't you know English?" the kid said. Yes, I do," David replied. "I remember, I know most of it. All of it, actually." The blonde looked at his friends, and they shared a laugh that David did not understand. "What's that?" the boy repeated. "Grok, as in was it, was apps, was ups, etc., etc., etc.?" The boys continued circling as David struggled with the words. When he was sure he could make no sense of them, he shrugged. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I'm not sure that I understand what—" "What's your 20?" the dark kid interrupted, impatiently. David pondered this for a moment. I'm only 11, he replied, hoping this was the right answer. "KAH, freak geek," the red-haired boy laughed. "What's up with the mud in your ropes? Are you vagging?" David could only reply with a perplexed expression. The boys exchanged tight glances and then stepped off their boards. In a unified move that must have been rehearsed, they kicked downwards, causing the boards to flip up into their hands. They continued circling David, but on foot now and much closer. He could feel their breath as they shot questions at him. "I said, like, what's up? Like, what are you doing here?" said the blonde kid. "Yeah, and where you from?" said the dark one. "Yeah, and what's with the crap on your clothes? You a vagrant?" said Red. David didn't know where to start answering. "I was just, I'm from, He finally gave up with an exasperated sigh. "I need food," he admitted. The boys looked at each other again. "He's vagging!" they said in unison and broke out into laughter. David watched them laughing and slapping each other's hands. He quickly decided he'd had enough. "It was nice meeting you," he said, "but I really have to go." The blond boy was suddenly standing chest to chest with David. There was a look in his eyes that David hadn't seen since the night Martin had sent him on his fateful quest for Mommy's hair. "Did I cut you loose? 'Cause I don't remember cutting you loose," the boy said, cocking his head to the side. David didn't understand the meaning of the boy's head movements any better than he understood his words, but he was intimidated nonetheless. "I have to go find some food now," he said politely. He was starting to feel dizzy again. He didn't want to pass out like he had in the forest. "Skin or tin," the dark boy said, a new menace in his eyes. David screwed up his face in confusion. "Your crew," the boy clarified. "You vaggin' with flesh or fiber." David thought he knew this one. "I'm a boy," he replied confidently. Was that all this was about? "I said your crew," the boy yelled. "I can tell you're skinned by the stank coming off you." They all laughed again and slapped each other's palms. David moaned and tried to leave, but he was quickly surrounded. The blond-haired boy bumped hard against him. "Play nice," Teddy commanded. The boys shot amused glances at the super toy. "Aw, how cute," said the blonde. "I'll bet you like to dress it up sometimes, huh? And pretend you're having the girls over for tea?" David didn't understand this at all. He tried to move away again, but the red one intervened, blocking his path. "We'll let you go when he know we got all the foe," the boy said. The blonde took his eyes off David and shot an irritated look at Red. "The foe?" he said. Yeah," Red replied defensively. "You know, the foe, like info." The dark kid guffawed. "KAH, Scooter, that's DOS. When'd you dream that one up?" "F.O., Drake, it makes sense," Scooter replied. But his friends continued to laugh at him. The boy blushed and planted his hands on his hips, pouting until they finished. When Scooter had been sufficiently reprimanded, the blonde turned his attention back to David. "What's your name?" he said. It was the first question that David had understood, but he realized that he couldn't tell him his real name. There was an APB out for him, whatever that was. He had to use the name on the bracelet, the one the kiosk had called him, and unfortunately, that had been Susan, David said, weakly, knowing what was coming next. The three boys' jaws dropped in a look that was equal parts disbelief and unbridled joy. "KAH!" they yelled in unison. Then they fell into laughter again. "OMFG, this just gets better and better," said the one named Drake. The blonde boy forced himself to be serious and pressed his finger against David's chest. "Okay, Miss Susan," he said. "I'm Corey, and I'm so sorry that we huffed at your name, but see, we all have guys' names, like Normal and everything, Grok. And we all take showers so we don't stank like a septic tank. And we don't live in the shrubbies with the vags or the fiberheads, so you'll have to excuse us if we come off a little intolerant and dickish, etc." He turned to his friends. "But we're generally a good-natured crew, aren't we, guys?" The others nodded, with exaggerated looks of sincerity on their faces. "See," Corey said, turning back to David. "But since we can't use our power boards on the public tracks anymore, we sort of claimed this court, Grok. And we can't allow trespassers, even normal ones, but especially not a vag dressed in rags." His friends laughed dutifully. Corey waited until they were finished and continued. "But like I said, we're usually all nice and cuddly, etc. So we'll let you go if you can just pass one little test." David did not understand most of Corey's words, but the idea was clear. "Okay," he said, hoping it would be over soon. His stomach was beginning to twist. "What shall I do?" he asked. Corey chuckled again. "You shall ride," he mocked. He held a hand out to Scooter. "Flip it," he said. Scooter's cocky expression changed into one of a petulant child. "Why me? Let him ride yours," he cried. But Corey just continued holding out his hand, and the other boy finally relented, passing over his board. Corey pressed it against David's chest and let go. David caught it before it fell. "Bitch match," Corey explained. "Mano a mano, 3 strikes," he said, holding up an equal number of fingers. Then a dark smile spread on his face, and he cupped 2 of his fingers away, so that only one very significant finger was left standing. "Death mode," he said. Only one word had caught David's attention. "Death?" he repeated. Corey's dark smile turned into an even darker glare. He flicked a switch on his board and flung it to the ground. It hummed viciously over the asphalt. Corey jumped on it and shot out over the court. He spun dizzying loops, then cut back and forth with blinding speed. His board seemed to hiss and spit as he moved. The boy spun again and then shot towards the fence, banked a turn against it, and leveled out. He stopped suddenly and started pressing his legs back and forth in a teeter-totter fashion. After a few repetitions of this movement, Corey was bouncing high into the air, higher than David stood, and then coming back to earth and bouncing up again. On the last bounce, Corey crouched low, pressing the board so close to the ground that it seemed to snarl, and then shot so high that he glided smoothly over one of the hoops suspended above the court. He then hovered smoothly back to earth. Corey spun a few more quick loops before humming slowly towards David. "Death mode, biatch," he said, slapping his friend's hands as he passed. "I don't know how to do that," David said. "Do or do and die anyway," Scooter laughed. Corey nodded to acknowledge that Scooter had made a good one this time. "Let's play, little Susie," he said, and reached over to flick a switch on the board that David held in hand. It began to vibrate so violently that he dropped it. It fell to just inches above the ground and began gliding away slowly. "Don't let my board cruise," Scooter yelled, pushing David after it. David jumped and landed almost inadvertently on the power skate's smooth black surface. Instantly, it seemed, his feet were somehow glued to the thing. He tottered back and forth for a moment, trying to stay standing. But when he leaned back to correct his balance, the board shot out from under him. David hit the asphalt in a painful heap. Stars erupted behind his eyes. His breath whooshed out of him. He writhed in pain for a time, and then rose to hear Teddy complaining and scolding the boys. Corey was hovering a small circle around the angry super toy. When he saw David was getting up, he made a quick twist of his legs, and his board bumped Teddy on the head, sending the bear sprawling across the court. "Oops," Corey said, nonchalantly. Then he cruised close by David. "1 strike for you," he said, with a smile. David had been about to try and reason with the boy. He didn't know how to ride. He was tired and hungry. But something was now moving in the back of his head. It was red and pulsating, this thing. It came into his face, and his brows pinched as a dark thought rose to the foreground of his mind. "Okay," David said. "Let's go." "KAH!" Corey said, happily. But Drake suddenly intervened. "Screw it, Cor," he said, a hesitant look on his face. "The vag's a tard. Let him cut out. Let's glide." But Corey was obviously having too much fun. He dismissed Drake's suggestion with a flippant wave. "Only 2 strikes to go," he said. Drake shot an impatient glance at David, but there was something else in his eyes, something that suggested he felt Corey was getting out of line. Scooter's board hadn't gone too far. Without a rider, it had slowed after about 20 feet and was now moving away at a snail's pace. David brushed himself off and ran to catch it. He placed 1 foot hesitantly on the black surface, and the thing stopped, purring under the weight of his leg. Drake was suddenly beside David, moving in graceful circles and finally speaking in a language that David could understand. "Hey, Vag, bend your knees like this, hold your arms out for balance, lean forward and push your foot back to go forward, lean back and push to the front to slow down, and turn like this." Drake executed a quick circle as David watched. "And keep your feet flat or you'll break the membrane seal and fall off." Drake moved back and forth gracefully, and then spun a few more quick circles so David could see how it was done. David watched the boy's feet and thought he understood the principle. "And don't try any tricks, kid," Drake warned when he was through. "You're gonna get your butt kicked anyway, so just get it over with." David looked up and smiled at Drake. The boy frowned and rolled his eyes, but David thought he saw a quick wink there, too. Then Drake shot away. David jumped atop the board and felt his feet lock again. He bent his knees and fought to keep his balance. The board hummed under his feet and started moving ahead slowly. David followed Drake's instructions and found it to be easier than he had thought. In a few moments he was moving forward quickly, but then he saw the edge of the court coming his way. He managed to slow and then stop and move backwards, mimicking Drake's movements. He actually laughed when he felt the board start to turn beneath him. He leaned back automatically to compensate for the tilt and laughed again. Learning to move seemed easier now than it had been in his former life. His brain seemed to be programming itself, calculating balance and speed and distance with automatic precision. This was fun, he decided. He thought he could do this all day. But Corey was suddenly circling him and sneering. "Lesson's over, Vag. Time to rock." "Then let's rock," David yelled back. He shot ahead, feeling the air rushing against his face and a sudden, unexpected thrill racing through his veins. It was majestic, this feeling. He almost forgot that he was hungry as he glided quickly over the surface of the court. One of the posts was coming. David leaned and turned the board, uttering an involuntary "yes" as he shot quickly around it, hearing it whoosh as he sped by. He was trying to level out the turn when he heard a snarl behind him. He turned to see something black speeding towards him. A moment later, it had moved above him. David felt Corey's board connect with the top of his head and found himself lying on the asphalt again. "Strike two!" Corey laughed. The red vibrating thing came back into David's mind, and he quickly pushed himself up through his pain and humiliation. The board was only a few feet away. Corey was hovering just a few yards beyond that, slapping palms with Scooter and Drake. David found himself moving automatically. His pain was gone, his hunger forgotten. All that was left was a new level of anger that burned in his chest. He ran to the board and jumped onto its surface, felt his feet lock, leaned forward and pushed back. The board shot ahead. "The Vag!" Scooter yelled. But too late. Corey turned just in time to see David hit him. The boys spilled from their boards and onto the asphalt. David was up instantly. "Strike one!" he yelled and raced for his board. Corey was stunned, but he quickly regained his senses and was on board immediately after. "KAH, Vag, good one. Now feel my wrath," the boy said as he sped at David, his arm cocked and ready to strike. David tried to duck, but Corey was too fast, and he felt the world spin around him as he was knocked to the ground. Again. "Strike three, and you're out of here," Corey said with a laugh as he glided through a victory loop. David's head hurt. His back hurt. His mind raged. These boys knew he couldn't compete. It was unfair. It was cheap. The injustice meshed with his humiliation to form a perfect storm of rage. He jumped up and raced for the boy. A moment later, he was on the asphalt again. But this time, Corey was beneath him. David's fists flew. Spittle and indecipherable screams of outrage erupted from his mouth. He felt his fist connect with Corey's face, felt Corey connect with his. The boys went back and forth that way until David felt something hit him from behind. He looked up to see that Scooter and Drake were on him too, their fists beating against his head, their feet pounding his legs and arms. David lashed out at the three boys, screaming pitifully. He had been minding his own business. He'd only wanted something to eat. "Leave me alone!" he screamed. "Hey!" The new voice was deep and commanding. The boys parted, leaving David to lay crumpled and whimpering on the asphalt. He looked up through tearful eyes to see another group of boys gliding smoothly across the court. They were older, larger. They wore no uniforms, only torn and ragged shorts with bits of metal sewn into them and strange symbols drawn crudely on their t-shirts. The largest of the boys rode close to David. He was a heavy-set kid with dark, wavy hair that hung into his face. He stopped and looked at David for a moment, and then set a look of mock disgust on the young skaters. "What are you freaks doing messing with the vagrants again?" he said. "Didn't the cops already warn you about that?" Corey jumped up and started wiping at the white stains the asphalt had left on his leotard. "KAH, Todd, the vag messed with us first, Grok. We was just TCBing for the 20. David didn't understand most of this lie and didn't try to argue with the parts he did understand. But he felt a strange satisfaction knowing that he was responsible for the bruises already forming on Corey's face. The older boy smirked at Corey, and his friends laughed. Their deeper voices held a menace that made David's assailants step back. "Get off that gibberish, Corey. That's supposed to be cool or something," the large boy said. Then he looked at David, and something strange crossed his face. David cringed under that look, but after a moment he realized that it wasn't really spiteful, that it was more like amazement. "Yo, Marty, check this out," the older boy said, beckoning over his shoulder. A tall, skinny boy glided up beside the heavy-set one and looked down on David. David returned his gaze defiantly, wondering what kind of trouble these large kids had planned. But as he looked into the other boy's eyes, something flashed in his mind. "You little jerks cut out," the tall boy said, without taking his eyes off David. There was something strange in his voice, something strangely familiar. "KAH," Corey said. "KMA. We were riding this court before you guys." The tall boy kicked his board into sudden life and zipped out over the court with amazing speed. A moment later, Corey was laying on the ground, moaning and rubbing his head. Scooter and Drake had already got the point and were quickly racing away. "Grok that, you little snot," the tall boy said, as he zipped circles around Corey, passing so close that he caused the blond boy's hair to ruffle. "I'm counting to 5, the older boy said, "and if you're still here, that board is mine. 1, 2, 3. Corey didn't wait to find out if the threat was real. He shot a rude gesture over his shoulder as he sped away, but the older boy ignored it. He zipped close to David and stopped. He kicked his board so that it flipped up and landed neatly under his arm. Then he looked down on David and scratched his head. David studied the boy. There was definitely something familiar about him. He was tall and thin, his hair straight and black, dangling over his shoulders. He wore tattered blue pants that had been cut at the knee and a wrinkled plaid shirt with menacing words scrawled on the sleeves. But his eyes, David knew those eyes. "Martin?" he whispered in awe. Martin Swinton stepped backwards, his face twisted and mouth open in shock and disbelief. "No way," he said. "No effing way."